The wind came down from the mountains that morning like it had a grudge against the living. It swept through the narrow dirt streets of Red Creek, rattling the wooden signs above the general store, lifting dust from the frozen ground and throwing it against the faces of anyone foolish enough to be standing outside. And yet, despite the cold, despite the biting gray of that November sky, the people of Red Creek had gathered, not because something wonderful was happening, but because something unusual had arrived. A single horse-drawn wagon rolled slowly down the main road, its wheels groaning against the half-frozen mud. The horse was old but steady, its breath rising in white clouds against the cold air. And on the seat of that wagon, holding the reins with calm, unhurried hands, sat a woman alone. She wore a dark wool coat, a plain bonnet, and boots that had clearly seen 100 miles of hard road. Her face was composed, not cold, not proud, but still. Still in the way that people are still when they have learned that the world will stare, and they have decided to let it. Her name was Eliza Hart, and she had come to Red Creek carrying nothing but a wooden chest, a worn leather satchel, and a lifetime of knowing how to heal what other people could not. She had been traveling for 3 years by then, 3 years of arriving in towns that needed her and leaving towns that feared her, 3 years of sleeping in barns and back rooms, and on the worst nights, beneath the open sky wrapped in a horse blanket. She carried medicines she had learned to make herself, herbs pressed between the pages of handwritten notebooks, tinctures in dark glass bottles, bandages rolled with careful hands. She carried the knowledge given to her by an old healer woman named Clara Webb, who had taken Eliza in when she was 9 years old and had nothing, and who had spent 20 years teaching her everything she knew before passing quietly in her sleep, with her hand in Eliza's hand. Eliza had promised Clara she would keep going, so she kept going. But Red Creek on that gray November morning was not interested in what she carried. Red Creek was interested in the spectacle of a woman traveling alone and the opportunity that spectacle provided for those with sharp tongues and idle time. Agnes Pike stood in the center of the road with her arms folded, flanked by 2 other women who always seemed to appear wherever Agnes appeared, like shadows that had grown their own opinions. Agnes was the kind of woman who believed that speaking loudly was the same thing as speaking truthfully. She watched Eliza's wagon slow to a stop near the water trough and called out, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "Another medicine woman, is it? Last one through here sold my husband a bottle of colored water for $2 and left before morning." There was laughter. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the comfortable laughter of people who feel safe joining in. Eliza sat on the wagon seat and let the laughter settle. She did not argue. She did not smile to apologize. She simply looked at Agnes Pike the way a mountain looks at wind, present, unmoved, patient. She was still sitting there, quietly tying her horse to the post, when the sound came from the far end of town. It was not a loud sound. It was the kind of sound that stops the blood, a low, cracking collapse, followed by a single human cry that cut through the cold air like a blade. Every head on the street turned toward the sawmill at the edge of Red Creek, where a thin column of dust was rising above the roofline. And then a boy came running, barefoot despite the cold, his face white as chalk. "Ben Carter's down," he shouted, his voice breaking. "The timber rack gave way. He's bleeding bad, and Doc Harmon ain't here. Doc Harmon's been gone 2 months." The street went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before. This was the quiet of people who suddenly understood that laughter had been the wrong thing to be doing. Every eye, slowly and without plan, turned toward Eliza Hart. She was already reaching into the back of her wagon. She did not run. Running would have meant panic, and panic in a healer is a disease that spreads to everyone in the room. She walked with purpose, her leather satchel over one shoulder, her wooden chest carried in both arms, her boots steady on the frozen ground. The crowd parted for her without quite deciding to. She moved through them and through the sawmill doors and knelt beside Ben Carter, who was 22 years old and lying in the sawdust with a piece of broken timber across his leg and blood soaking dark through the cloth of his trousers. She worked for 4 hours. She sent people for clean water and clean cloth, and she spoke to them in a voice that was calm and specific and left no room for questions that didn't need asking. She cleaned the wound with hands that did not tremble. She packed it with a compress she made herself. She held pressure where pressure was needed and stitched where stitching was needed, and all the while she spoke quietly to Ben Carter, who was conscious and frightened, telling him to breathe slowly, telling him he was going to be all right, telling him to think of something good. Think of someone you love, she told him, her eyes on her work. Keep them in your mind and breathe toward them. Ben Carter closed his eyes and breathed, and his color slowly, over the long hours, came back. By the time the winter sun was setting behind the mountains, Ben Carter was alive.
The people who had been watching from the doorway of the sawmill did not laugh now. They stood with their hats in their hands, and they looked at Eliza Hart the way people look at something they did not expect to be as real as it turned out to be. Among them stood Nathan Reed. He was not a man who spoke quickly or laughed loudly or took up more space than he needed. He was somewhere past 50, with a face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work and a quietness about him that was not shyness, but something more considered. The quietness of a man who had decided long ago that words should carry weight or not be spoken at all. He owned a farm 2 miles outside Red Creek, a good piece of land that he had built with his own hands after coming west 20 years before. He had lost his wife to fever 8 years ago and raised his son alone, and had never quite found a reason to stop working long enough to feel the loneliness that waited for him in the evenings. He watched Eliza Hart pack her instruments back into her wooden chest with the same careful order she had taken them out, and he walked up to her and said without preamble, "The inn's full, and the cold tonight will be serious. I have a spare room at the farm if you want it, no charge." Eliza looked at him for a moment. She was accustomed to gratitude that came with conditions, to kindness that was really a transaction. But something in the plainness of his offer, the way it was neither a charity nor a favor, but simply a fact, made her nod. "Thank you," she said. "I'll accept." She stayed through the winter. She had only meant to stay a week, perhaps 2, but the cold came hard that year, and the people of Red Creek began to find their way to Nathan's farm, first for Ben Carter's follow-up care, then for a child with a deep chest cough, then for old Mr. Hale, whose breathing had been troubling him since September. Eliza moved through these cases with the same calm attention she brought to everything, sitting beside each patient for as long as was needed, writing her observations in her notebooks by lamplight long after the house had gone quiet. Nathan watched all of this without comment. He was not a man who commented unnecessarily, but he noticed. He noticed that she never treated a patient as though they were an inconvenience. He noticed that she remembered the name of every child she had seen, even weeks later. He noticed that when people thanked her, she accepted their gratitude simply, without deflecting it and without holding on to it either, as if thanks were weather, pleasant when it came, but not something to build a life around.
They fell into an evening habit, the two of them, sitting on the covered porch after supper, when the work of the day was finished, watching the last light leave the mountains. They did not always talk, but one evening, when the sky had turned that particular shade of deep blue that comes just before full dark, Nathan asked her where she had learned what she knew, and Eliza, who rarely spoke of herself, found herself telling him about Clara Webb, about being 9 years old and alone, and finding a door open where she had expected none, about 20 years of learning, and the night she had sat with Clara's hand in hers and felt the last breath leave and understood that she was now on her own. "She gave me everything she had," Eliza said. "The only way to honor that was to keep giving it forward." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "How long will you keep traveling?" Eliza looked at the dark outline of the mountains. "Until I find a reason to stop." Nathan said nothing more that night, but he did not forget what she said. In February, a rumor moved through Red Creek the way rumors always moved through small towns, fast and shapeless and certain of itself. Someone had heard from someone who had heard from a man passing through that a woman had died in childbirth in a town 40 miles east, and that a traveling healer woman had been present and had failed to save her. The rumor attached itself to Eliza's name before she knew it was coming. People who had shaken her hand in gratitude 2 weeks before now spoke to her with a new, careful distance, the way people speak to someone they are reconsidering. Nathan came to her directly. He did not soften the question or dress it up. "I've heard the talk," he said. "Tell me what happened." And Eliza told him the truth, which was harder to tell than a lie would have been. There had been a woman, and there had been a birth that went wrong in ways that were beyond any medicine available in 1850 on the frontier. She had ridden 40 miles in a snowstorm when the message reached her, and she had arrived to find the situation already beyond saving. She had stayed through the night trying. She had failed. "I have thought about that night every day since," she said, and her voice did not break, but it came close. Nathan looked at her for a long moment and then said, with the quiet certainty of someone who has also lived with grief and has learned the difference between guilt and responsibility, "Not every story has someone to blame." And that was all he said. He never raised the subject again. And somehow that was more comforting than anything longer would have been. Spring came to Red Creek the way spring comes to mountain country, slowly and then suddenly, the snow retreating up the slopes, the creek running loud with meltwater, the first green appearing in the fields around Nathan's farm, like a rumor of warmth that turned out to be true. The town held its spring gathering, as it did every year, with lanterns strung between the trees and fiddle music and children running in the grass, and people who had survived another hard winter standing together and feeling, for one evening, that the world was a good place to be. Nathan found Eliza at the edge of the gathering and stood beside her for a moment watching the dancers. Then he turned to her and held out his hand, not with ceremony, but with the directness that was simply his nature, and said, "Will you walk with me?" They walked away from the music, down to the place where the creek bent through the cottonwood trees, and the sound of the fiddle grew soft behind them. Nathan stopped and looked at the water, and then looked at her. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because this town needs a healer, not because winter's coming, because I've come to know you, and I don't want you to go." Eliza stood very still. In all her years of traveling, in all the towns and all the doorways and all the mornings of arriving somewhere new, no one had ever said those words to her, not those words in that order for that reason. People had wanted her skills, people had wanted her usefulness, but this quiet man with the weathered face was telling her that he wanted her, the person behind the medicine chest, the woman behind the careful hands. She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was held tight. Her eyes filled, not with sadness, but with something that had no name, except perhaps relief, the relief of being finally, fully seen.
"I want to stay," she said. They were married on a Saturday in June. The whole town came. Ben Carter came, walking steadily now on a leg that had healed clean and straight, and he stood in the back and watched with the particular emotion of a man who knows he owes his life to the woman at the front of the church. Agnes Pike came too, and if she did not apologize in words, she brought a pie, and she stayed to help clean up afterward. And in Red Creek in 1852, that counted for something. Nathan built her a clinic in the center of town, a small wooden building with 2 rooms and good light from the south-facing windows. Above the door they hung a painted sign that read, "Hart and Reed Community House." People came for medicine and they came for counsel, and sometimes they came simply because they needed to sit somewhere quiet with someone who would listen. And Eliza sat with all of them. She sat with them the way Clara Webb had once sat with a 9-year-old girl who had nothing, and she gave forward everything she had been given. Red Creek was not a perfect town. No town is. But it became, over the years that followed, a town that had learned something about the difference between a stranger and a neighbor, and about how quickly one can become the other when someone is willing to be seen before they are understood.
Eliza Hart had traveled for 3 years looking for a reason to stop. She had not known when her wagon rolled down that frozen street on that November morning that the reason was already there, standing quietly at the edge of a crowd, watching with steady eyes, waiting for the moment to simply say, "I have a spare room, and if you want it, it's yours." Some people find home in a place, some people find it in a purpose, and some lucky few find it in a person who sees them fully and says, without condition, "Stay." That is the kind of love worth traveling 3 years to find. If this story touched something in your heart, you are not alone. Stories like Eliza's remind us that being truly seen by even one person can change the entire direction of a life. If you are new to Desert Heart, subscribe and stay with us. Every story we tell is chosen to remind you that kindness is never wasted, that courage comes in quiet forms, and that it is never too late to find the place where you belong. Ring the bell so you never miss a story. We will be here, and we are glad you found us. This story carries meaningful value on several levels. It reflects the real history of frontier medicine in 1850s America, when trained physicians were scarce in rural and mountain communities, and traveling healers, often women, filled a critical gap in public health. It honors the courage it took for women to work in skilled professions during an era when they were routinely dismissed and doubted. It addresses the psychology of community prejudice and how quickly judgment can form in small, isolated societies, and how just as quickly it can dissolve when confronted with undeniable evidence of character. It speaks to the human need for belonging, not as a weakness, but as a fundamental truth, and models the kind of quiet, respectful love built on observation and honesty rather than performance. For older American audiences, it carries the additional resonance of frontier values, self-reliance, community responsibility, and the dignity of a life devoted to service. This story teaches without lecturing. It shows rather than tells, and that is the highest form of educational storytelling.